The following is a presentation of the Healthcare Facilities Network. Hello, and welcome to the Healthcare Facilities Network. I'm Peter Martin, president of Gosselin Martin Associates, and I am happy to be joined today by Master Chief Vince Patton. Vince, welcome.
Hello.
So, Vince, let me just read a little bit of his background for you, because we have a very specific topic that we'd like to cover today. But Vince was the 8th Master Chief Petty Officer of the United States Coast Guard from May 1988 until his retirement for more than 30 years of active Coast Guard duty. Vince retired from the Coast Guard. He hasn't retired, but he retired from the Coast Guard in 2002. Vince was the first African-American to reach the rank of Master Chief in the United States Coast Guard. And in this position, he was the senior enlisted advisor to the Commandant of the Coast Guard, with his primary focus on quality of life issues, career development, work environment, and personnel matters that affected more than 45,000 active duty, reserve, and civilian personnel. Vince's illustrious career included staff and operational assignments, both afloat and ashore, throughout the United States, and he had joint military service assignments in Cuba and Haiti. After his retirement from the Coast Guard in 2002, Vince has held a variety of senior executive level positions. He has also served in the world of academia. Vince is presently the Senior Vice President for Leadership Development with NewDay USA, and he serves on boards for several public service and nonprofit organizations. Vince also has numerous military honors, including Distinguished Service Medals, 2 Meritorious Service Medals, 3 Coast Guard Commendation Medals, 3 Coast Guard Achievement Medals, the Commandant's Letter of Commendation Ribbon, and 8 Meritorious Team Awards, and he even has 8 Coast Guard Good Conduct Awards. Vince, thank you for joining.
Thank you.
So just a bit of background. I saw Vince give a keynote in 2001 at the New England Healthcare Engineers Society. That was the fall conference, right, Vince? That was in Newport. And it was a great presentation. And following the presentation, CJ Brown, who I think was the president of NEHES at the time, I said, "Hey, CJ, do you have Vince's email address? I would love to reach out to him to talk to him about the presentation he gave." And it was really fantastic. You talked a lot, but you talked about core values. You talked about your career. It was fantastic. So I just wanted to start there, Vince.
Okay.
Tell our audience a little bit, since this is the Healthcare Facilities Network, we talk a lot about careers and career paths. I still recall the story you told about wanting to join the Navy to follow in the footsteps of your brother, but ending up in the Coast Guard. Great story. Can you tell our listeners?
Well, yeah, I think, I was a child. I shouldn't say was. I still feel in some ways I'm still a child. But I was the kind of kid that imagination kind of centered my whole life. I mean, I was okay with playing by myself. My imaginary friends and so forth. And while a lot of people thought I was a little nuts at it, I was doing pretty good. In fact, little did I know, as I look back now, some 60 plus years later in life, that the imagination part of me really grew me strong. So to tell you that is to tell you, in that story about how I ended up in the Coast Guard, it had to do with imagination. First, the imagination of my oldest brother, who even to this day I still admire. He is still my number one mentor, and we're 8 years apart. And what he did, I wanted to do it. And every time I wanted to do it, I didn't want to be better than him. I actually wanted to be almost as good as he is. I mean, I never wanted to surpass him. I think part of why I never wanted to surpass him, because there was a little bit of comfortability for me, and to not get too far ahead of him, because then all of a sudden I'm on my own, and he was doing things so well. So that was kind of where my focus was, and so that led me up to wanting to join the Navy, because when he graduated from high school at age 18, and we're from a big family, and we couldn't afford college for anybody, and so his way into college as well as his way out of Detroit, Michigan, because we lived in inner city Detroit, Michigan, and and the challenges that come with living in the inner city. If you use your imagination, part of that is you want to get out. And that was that part with me about wanting to get out because my brother wanted to get out. So he goes into the Navy, and as he sends me letters home and pictures, and I got to visit with him when he was down in Norfolk, Virginia at one time on a ship. And man, the Navy was for me. I was going to do this. And then he decided he's going to make a career. And of course, he made a very successful career in his own right. He enlisted, and then he later became an officer and moved on and so forth. And so,
did he retire out of the Navy, Vince?
He retired from Navy. He did 30 years in Navy, and he retired as a captain. And so, and that 8-year gap difference, by that time he had just become an officer at the time I joined the Coast Guard. And so that's what I was going to do. I was going to join the Navy. And so on my 17th birthday, I was, it's all I talked about. So everybody, my family, my neighbors, my school buddies, everybody knew I was going in the Navy. So since that's all I talked about, on my 17th birthday, I was a senior in high school, and there's a program which is still in existence today that you can enlist in the military at age 17 with parental consent if you're a senior in high school. And when you graduate, off to the military you go. So that was my 17th birthday present, was folks giving me the okay to enlist into the Navy. So I go down to the recruiting office one day over my 17th birthday to go find the Navy recruiter. And I was so excited, and I walked into the federal building, downtown Detroit, Michigan, long, narrow hallway where all the recruiters were lined up. And at the very end of the hallway, I saw this guy in the blue Navy uniform at his desk. He was on the telephone, and I made a beeline for that office. Never once looked at anything except seeing him sitting at that desk. And I walked in, and he stopped his phone call and said, "Have a seat, I'll be right with you." So just as I got ready to sit down, I glanced at the pictures on the wall. Now, Navy ships are gray. All these ships were white, and they said Coast Guard. What I didn't realize when I walked into the door, first off, it was a big sign that said Coast Guard Recruiting Office. But also during that time, we're talking 1971, the Coast Guard uniform was the same as the Navy uniform. Huh. So the hatch, but but the uniform itself was the same. And of course, that's all I paid attention to, was the uniform. So anyway, I make this big mistake one day over my 17th birthday, and I'm embarrassed. And then I decided, well, you know what? I'll pretend I want to listen to him, then I'll go find a Navy recruiter. So now here's where imagination comes in again, because he's on the phone. He's talking to an applicant, and I'm fidgety as well as nervous. Really didn't want to be there. So as I walk around, I start studying the pictures, and then I come across hanging on the wall was what is called a unit citation. In other words, an entire unit does something really, really good. They get an award, a unit commendation. Just so happens there was a unit citation hanging on the wall. There was a reason for it, because it was representing one of the greatest history rescues in the Coast Guard that happened off the coast of Cape Cod in 1952. And the short story of it, the Coast Guard sent out a 36-foot patrol boat in heavy weather, a nor'easter to be exact, and rescued 28 people off of a freighter in heavy seas in a 36-foot boat. So I read this thing and I said, wow. And the recruiter stopped this phone call, looked at me and said, "I guarantee you'll do something like that in your first 4 years in the Coast Guard." Wow. That's how I ended up in the Coast Guard. so imagination, yeah.
Right. Two follow-ups to that. Number one, when you go home and you tell your mom, your dad, and you tell your brother, what was their reaction? And then number two, was the recruiter correct? Did you end up doing something like that within your first 4 years of the Coast Guard?
Well, when I got home, first off, my my father was worried because he called the Navy recruiter. See, I had already done all the preliminary stuff. All I had to do was go in there and fill the paperwork out and schedule for a physical, because I was in the Naval Sea Cadet program. So I had already taken a test. So I didn't have to go in and get scheduled for a test. That's all I had to do. Go in, fill out the application, get scheduled for a physical, and then they would give me a date after all that was done. So my dad calls the Navy recruiter, and Navy recruiter, they hadn't come in, and so I'm gone for several hours. And when I come home with all this recruiting literature and decide I'm going to join the Coast Guard, my father was, he was actually very concerned for on two accounts. One was, how can you make an abrupt decision or change like that after you've gone through 7 years of, you wanted to be like your brother, you want to do this, you know all of these things about the Navy, and then you just come home and you want to do that. The second thing he was concerned about was we got to look at it in a period of time. Again, this was 1971, and the Coast Guard at that particular period of time had a very, very, very small representation of minorities in the Coast Guard, and there were and there was some concern on his part, not just with the small representation, but with the fact that where you get stationed at in the Coast Guard. And he showed me, he pulled out a road atlas. He shows me Oregon, he shows me the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, he shows me Maine, and he shows me all the places where there were little or no African Americans or any people of color closer to me to be around. So that was part of his concern, that he didn't think it was a good idea for me to go in the Coast Guard. But my mother, on the other hand, actually, not only did she think differently, but I witnessed a verbal fight going on at that point, because she yelled at my father about, you don't tell him that. Wow. Instead, what you need to be talking to him about is how we are going to support him. Wow. This is his decision. This is what he wants to do. And then my mother looks at me and says, you have walked in your brother's footsteps long enough. Wow. And this is an opportunity for you to step out on your own. So
that's pretty powerful.
It was very powerful. And, of course, the way she sternly said that to me, as I went in the Coast Guard, the fears that my father kind of put into my head kind of went out the window completely. Now, did I endure with some struggles and so forth as a result of my color? I did. But at the same time, I was able to deal with it. And not only was I able to deal with it effectively, but I soon found that other people who I served with in the Coast Guard were there to deal with it with me. And I'll never forget very early in my career when I was going to communication school out in California, which is about 60 miles north of San Francisco, where there were very few people of color in that area and so forth, that I encountered a situation that someone called me a name, and then I had 3 of my other buddies with me that went to school with me, and they just took up for me. I mean, they really took up for, to the point that they were willing to go to jail. I mean, one guy was about ready to haul off and smack the lady. And we had to pull him off. So but that was and it still is an experience that I think about today. And interestingly, those guys that I hung out with, here it is 50 plus years later, we still hang out together. In fact, just this past February, we went out to Petaluma, California to celebrate our 50th anniversary of graduating from radioman school. And wow. We sort of tried to relive that event where the one guy was about ready to smack a lady. But the Coast Guard kind of really showed me at that particular period of time that, you can do what you want to, you can do whatever you want to do. Again, the imagination part completely just sort of consumed me. And even to this day, as I look at, as I focus on things that I do in my present job and working as senior vice president at NewDay USA, which is a mortgage company. And then I also teach leadership and ethics at Northeast Maritime Institute. And all those things, I I always remind myself of that vision, that imagination part that kind of draws into making things work, and how I take a couple steps back to try to figure out a situation and how to deal with it. And whenever you try to deal with a problem, what do? You imagine, right? You work through that imagination process. So I owe it all to my many years ago that I wanted to be Superman. And that's another funny story. We can get into it another time about my Superman story.
I was actually going to ask you what when you imagine things, is there anything that you imagined you wanted to be? Could you remember that? So was it Superman? Were you imagining Superman when you were that little kid?
I did. I imagine, of course, a little kid like that, you grew up, you think Superman's for real. You think the Lone Ranger's for real. And so that, and no one could tell me anything differently. And because I imagined it, and I believed in it. And I'm so glad that I did it, because even at this age, I still watch those shows.
Yeah.
There's a couple nostalgia cable channels. I will watch those shows because here I am, 68 years old, and I'm watching these shows of long time ago. But that imagination never went away, and that
it's funny you say that. So I'm a little bit older than I'm like 5 years older than my wife, but I'll watch, because TV. There's nothing funny on it. It's all like reality shows. So if you're not watching sports, there's nothing on TV. But I'll put on, MASH is on now.
Yeah.
I'll put on Andy Griffith. They had a Gomer Pyle episode on where I'm just, I was laughing the other night watching Gomer Pyle, and my wife's like, "What are you laughing at?" Because I'm in another room. But it's just funny, and you kind of lose yourself back at that different time, and it just removes you away.
Exactly. And I think we need to have that. We need to take ourselves out of the world of reality every once in a while. I mean, that laugh is so important to us. Yeah. It helps generate that whole sense of feeling within us and understanding us, and to not lose that sense of humor, which is so important, that helps us as we look at our innovational way of thinking too. So yeah, humor is great. And we need
it is. So tell me, Vince, as Master Chief Petty Officer, what is that title mean, and how do you attain it?
Well, okay, so it's kind of a little confusing to some people if they haven't served in the military. So first of all, the position that I held as Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard is both a rank and a position. There's only one person at a time that can hold that rank and position, and it's typically over 4 years. In fact, all of my predecessors and successors have served 4 years. So it's a position that the Commandant of the Coast Guard, who is the 4-star Admiral, sort of picks one enlisted person to be the senior ranking enlisted person for the entire service. And it's not a ceremonial role. It's really the position involves that you've got your number one person, your CEO, so to speak, that needs to have a conscience, that needs to have, when decisions are looked upon, thoughts and ideas, that you go to the conscience to see how is this going to work in the field and with the rank and file. When you make policies, you set up regulations and so forth, how is this impacting our people, especially in the Coast Guard, where it's a pretty fast-paced profession for a lot of reasons, because of what the Coast Guard's involved with, particularly with search and rescue and law enforcement, pollution control, and all the host of other missions that the Coast Guard does. And people are placed in these positions at a very young age. And the part of that is because the Coast Guard is small. As you read my bio, with 45,000 people that were in at the time. The number's now up now. It's over 50,000 now. But at the time I was in 20 years ago, when I retired, about 45,000. But, you kind of did the work of 10 people. And you know what? The funny part of it is, to every coastie, if you were to just interview every coastie and they talk about what they do and they name 10 or 11 different things that they do, they don't even feel tired or fatigued about it, and say, God, how could you do all those things? Well, we're kind of conditioned into doing those things and working at that. But it takes also that to not lose sight of the fact that you have people doing multiple roles and so forth. Somebody's still got to be on the lookout and make sure that they're doing it effectively, that they're being taken care of, that you tell the boss that, there's a time to slow down, or time to look at the equipment that we have, or the training that we do, or when we go before Congress, we, both myself as well as the Commandant of the Coast Guard, to talk about what our service is doing and plead for funding for the things of what we want and need. So that's what the position of the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard is. And each service has a very similar role. Like the Army has the Sergeant Major of the Army. The Marine Corps has the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. The Air Force has the Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force. The Navy has the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy. And now we have a Space Force, which has a Chief Master Sergeant of the Space Force. So you always have that one person above. But you do have other Master Chiefs, so there are Master Chiefs in the Coast Guard, and there's a Master Chief of the Coast Guard. So the other Master Chiefs are like the senior enlisted folks within their specialty, based on the type of work and role they do. And there's several of them. Like in the Coast Guard, for example, at the time when I was selected as Master Chief of the Coast Guard, I was among 315 Master Chiefs. I got selected for that. I think they're up to like 360 or so Master Chiefs in the Coast Guard today.
Were your parents alive when you got selected in 1998?
My mother was alive,
what was her reaction?
It was, it actually took my mother a bit of a while to really understand what was happening. I mean, I talked about it so much, and when I made Master Chief, not Master Chief of the Coast Guard, but when I made Master Chief, she actually thought that was it. She said, "Oh, you made it! You congratulations, blah blah blah." And then I said, "Well, I want to become Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard." She said, "Well, what is that? Aren't you already a Master Chief?" "Well, I am, but I'm not the Master Chief." Right. And so it took her a while to figure that out. And then when I became the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, she was very excited. And let me tell you something, mothers are great, especially mothers that like to brag and so forth. She took full credit because it really was her that told my father that I'm going to do what I want to do, and we're going to support him. She always told that story 100 times over to anybody who would listen. So yeah, you want to talk about a proud mom. Yeah, she was right there.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So Vince had appeared on our High Reliability podcast back at the end of 2021. And one of the concepts that you talked about opportunities of innovation, and how you didn't feel that companies can take full advantage of opportunities of innovation that they're faced with or that they have today. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about today, or talk about today. If from your experience, and again, you're still in you've really been in leadership development kind of your whole career. I mean, even with your imagination, you were leadership developing yourself, right? I mean, did it start back then?
Oh, let me tell you how many times I was president of the United States.
Yeah, so your whole life has been.
My whole life has been that way. Yeah, it started with Superman, and then
right.
it never ended.
Were you Superman and president at the same time, or did Superman become president?
No, I had so many different characters of me. Superman couldn't be president, and the president couldn't be Superman.
That's very true. So, what are some, though, Vince? What are some opportunities of innovation? And do you have examples of leading or leadership within opportunities of innovation, and how companies, whether it be private companies, military, some examples that you can cite that are illustrative of that? So I guess I would ask, first thing, what is an opportunity of innovation in your eyes? And then number two, are there positive examples of companies taking advantage of them, and what did they do?
Well, I'm going to start with the beginning of this podcast, when I said the word imagination. And and I think all too often that companies, the corporate level part I'm talking about, fail to recognize how imagination is so important in moving forward. Because what happens is at the corporate level, and I experienced this in the job that I have, and that's part of my job. I'm still kind of the conscience to the CEO in the basic part of my job, and that is we change. There are different things that change. The cultural change is going. Always be cognizant of what's going on, because our workforce represents those changes, and so do not ignore that. When if there are the young people that come to work in my company, everybody's got to do suit and tie, and we have one dress down day on a Friday, and and of course it's got to be within taste and so forth. But some of that imagination thing that I had to tell them, as far as to get the innovation part is that to get the company to recognize the fact that, look, when you walk out of this building, at the end of the day, you stop at the 7-Eleven, you stop at the gas station, you stop at the supermarket or something like that. You're among the rest of the people. You're among people where you will see young people wearing jeans with holes in them. Okay? And then you're going to find there are more people with holes in their jeans than not. And rather than turning your nose up, understand that. That's just one example. So I take that type of an example to also put into play with looking at what we do and how we do things, and to know how to do things better is, first of all, imagine what do we want as far as what would be better. Because what happens at the corporate level sometimes is that in looking at progress, looking at improvements, that the corporate side talks about it, but can't articulate what that improvement is outside of the revenue part. So we've got to get beyond that. I'm not against the revenue side of it. That's what makes the world go round today. So that's how I get paid. So I'm not gonna be nasty about the fact that enterprise is so important. But there's more to that, and to be effective and to be effective at trying to get to the top and to stay on top and focus, is that you got to use your imagination. Look at what is the improvement that we're looking for. What's the productivity that's reasonable, that not only will help to support the improvement of the company, but to help to support the improvement of each and every individual within the company. This is where development is so important, because innovation equates to development. And what do I mean by that is that when you're looking at how things should focus and looking forward, visioning how things can go and so forth, you got to develop the people to make that happen. You just don't let them learn by osmosis.
Right.
You got to take the time for them to do that. You've got to be real with yourself, that particularly in the world of imagination, that while you can in a split second, or as the term that most New Englanders like to use, the New York minute, it takes a lot longer. It takes what they call a molasses mile, or some of the other Midwestern terms I hear picked up a lot. But look, don't get discouraged when something's going to take a little longer than what it does. You pick up along the way. The innovation is, how did you improve along the way? What kind of things along the way that you may have to do some kind of a adjustment to be able to make it work to the better of getting to the improvement side. So success is, it's really about perseverance. It's really about putting things in its right place as far as being effective to be successful.
Let me ask, did you talk about imagination, and you've always used your imagination when you were either in the Coast Guard, when you were at the leadership level, or now with NewDay? Do you recall, is there something that was in your imagination when you weren't in one of these positions that you ended up either implementing or kind of drawing back on your imagination from when you were younger that you used when you were in your leadership position? And do you recall what it was, what you did?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. Let me add the first story about me wanting to become Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, and I'll try to make it as quick as I can out of where imagination was what it was all about. And it all started with, if you remember, from that seminar that you were at, that I saw the picture of the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, and I saw this picture. I didn't know who he was, and I found it a little unique because remember I told you there are Master Chiefs in the Coast Guard, and then there's the Master Chief of the Coast Guard. Well, the Master Chiefs in the Coast Guard, they have 2 stars on their rank. The Master Chief of the Coast Guard has 3 stars, and only one person has that. So I saw this picture of this guy with 3 stars. My imagination quickly showed me in that uniform.
Was that when you were in the recruiting office back when you were 17?
That's when I was in boot camp. That was
okay.
Year later, 2 weeks into the Coast Guard. I'm in boot camp where they're yelling and screaming at you. You got to rush to go do things and so forth. And I stopped and paused long enough to look at a painting, a portrait of the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, and I wanted to be him. And it was kind of the same thing of what my brother, I wanted to do the things my brother did.
Yeah.
But I got calculated because once I got pulled down to earth that, you just can't become Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard the day you graduate from boot camp. and naive me, I thought it would take a couple of years, but not 26 years. But when I got pulled into understanding it and realizing things that you had to do and what you had to work for and how you had to do it, you become more of a student of that focus. And it was the same student of focus of what my brother did, because in my quest of wanting to be like my brother was he wasn't a Sea Cadet, but he was a Boy Scout. I became a Boy Scout. He became an Eagle Scout. I became an Eagle Scout. He went to a high school that was they now call them like magnet schools or charter schools and so forth. He went to one. I wanted to go there, and I went there. So that was part of that calculation of wanting to be like my brother. So when the calculation of wanting to become Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, I know you can't do this by yourself. So that means I've got to work as closely with people and start amassing myself with mentors. And you know what I found in my looking for mentors was bad people were just as good as the good people. Now that's kind of crazy to say that. And what I mean by that is that what the bad people did is what not to do. And they were just wonderful points of references for me to what not to do or what not to be and so forth. And it kind of helped me focus myself even more. And then that's balanced with the real good people of who you want to emulate, who you want to work with and become. That's a form of innovation too, because, you looked at what you see, and like I said, some of these mentors, you looked at them because they were senior to me. And so therefore they made it up the ladder up to a certain point. So you kind of make some kind of visional thought about that process. What did they do to get there? How did they do it? What kind of things did they work on? And then I would do those things or not do those things as the case may be. But that was part of my innovation focus in terms of moving up to the next step. Because see, to become the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, only one person gets selected, and you have no choice of that matter. When the Commandant of the Coast Guard is selected, who is selected by the President of the United States, that person, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, we have a woman Commandant of the Coast Guard now, makes that decision. And of course, they look at everybody's records, and so you've got to have, the shiniest coin you can make in order to be looked at effectively. And that's what it all came down to. But I couldn't have gotten there had it not been for the word of imagination and innovation.
Was that, and I know that you said, in your boot camp hanging on the wall, you saw that picture. Was that your, so that became your focus? Was that not, were you cognizant of that the whole time through? And when I say that, I guess, like when you took those leadership lessons, this is the day and age before we had the computers, before we had these little notepads on our phones. Did you note take? How did you go about kind of capturing what you were learning as you were going forward in your career?
I took notes. I mean,
Did you?
not just mental notes. I mean, I wrote things down. For example, I think about as I was working my way through, and I started focusing on people I wanted to emulate. I mean, I just got as nosy as I could in finding out what they did and how they did things. And there were some people that saw me a little bit too rambunctious, but then there are those that found me maybe intriguing is the word than anything else. That here's this kid that wants to do something that's just so out of the norm, and that they took the time for me. So I kept notes, and then I would find things. Like, for example, I think of, in 1979, and I remember this year. This is interesting. How could you remember a year when you read a passage of something and it sticks in your head? Well, I can remember because I was sitting in the dentist's office to get my teeth cleaned, and I pick up a magazine, a Life magazine. Back in those days, the Life magazine was still going.
Yeah.
And it was a cover story on the soccer player Pele. And I wasn't a soccer fan. I knew who he was, but I read it with an interest of maybe get to understand what soccer's all about. Why is this guy so well known and so forth? Anyway, I open this magazine, I read it, and Pele said something in that article in 1979 that I say to this day. Success is no accident. It is hard work, perseverance, learning, studying, sacrifice, but most of all, love of what you're doing or learning to do. That became my roadmap.
Yeah.
That was before the days that the words core values were in vogue then, but that became my roadmap. And the key phrase in that, love of what you're doing or learning to do. And so it began more to embrace into what I enjoy doing, what I love doing. That's why even to this day, I'm doing things because I love doing it.
Yeah.
I don't need to work. I mean, I really don't. I've got
Right. Yeah, you've put your time in.
yeah, I did. I put my time in, but I do it because I love it. I do it because I enjoy it. And Pele taught me that, and taught me that to the point that everything that I looked at with the flavor of loving what you do. And then as time moved on, when we started morphing into the late 80s with Deming's total quality management, and you learn about core values and things like that, then I said, oh, I get it. Core values. Yes. Okay. Now what am I? And I first thought about just stealing Pele's words were my core values, but then it turned out, you know what? I got to be me. And of course you think about what my mother said about walking my own path. So what is my path? What is it that I love what I do? And that's when I created my own personal core values of people, passion, and performance. Because the people part of that was about my focused understanding about people I work with, about the service that I'm in. I'm in the Coast Guard because I love what the Coast Guard does in helping people. I'm in the Coast Guard because the people in the Coast Guard make the Coast Guard great because they do great things. They're our greatest assets. And then the passion part was about loving what you do. It was about enthusiasm. It was about taking that full advantage of Pele's whole quoted comment about success being no accident and all those kinds of things. That became my passion. And then performance was the other part from Pele's, was about love what you do, but by learning, and learning was very important to me. Learning became so important to me because the whole learning aspect, it was like a jar of peanut butter. I mean, I don't do it anymore, but I used to always had to go in there and get a finger full of, and then it was never enough, 2, 3, 4, and I one time I used to be able to, not quite the whole jar, but until my finger couldn't reach down anymore.
Do you
But,
like crunchy peanut butter or regular peanut butter?
Either or.
Okay.
Crunchy was good too.
I like the crunchy.
Yeah, the crunchy was good too. But it was the performance part of it was prepare well to perform well. And that was the bigger driving force, is that if I were to have the opportunity to go up for the position of Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, then prepare in as many ways as I can. The education part was one thing, but then there were other things that I got involved with. I started my Coast Guard career in the specialty of communications, and then I later moved into personnel administration. Now I could have kept my head in the books and wrote good service records for you and all that stuff, but I wasn't satisfied with that. I learned how to become a maritime law enforcement boarding officer. I would go when I was on a ship, and I was on the ships that we had combination diesel and turbine engines, and it was the coolest whenever we would shift from diesel to turbine, and it sounded like the ship was going to fly out of the water. So I went down into the engine room and I learned how they did it. Curiosity, but it was more than just a curiosity, because it was also about people. Because now I'm rubbing shoulders with people who were in totally different professions than I was, and far much better than what I could have ever done and do it. But I got to learn a little bit more about it through their lens by just asking questions and being involved. So performance kind of captured that.
I would love to have you back on at a future point to kind of talk about your core value development, because I remember you talking about that in the presentation and how you went about that. But I would love to do that in the future, but I wanted to ask if it's okay with you. You've been talking about the mentors you learned from and things. Who do you look at historically? And they can be either, from the military, or you talked about Pele, you learned from him. Who have you learned from historically relative to, lessons that you used and you continue to use? Are there 2 or 3 people, anybody that stands out for you?
Nobody really stands out for me, because I have so many. In fact, my Facebook page, I only use it for one thing and one thing only. And this answers your question, is that I search for quotes of people that are relevant to our day-to-day life. Today's quote was quote about life. A quote about enthusiasm. A quote you think, and then I'd start digging into these individuals and so forth. I guess if I had to really name somebody off the top of my head, it's Mr. Rogers.
Oh, wow.
You laugh. But you know why I say Mr. Rogers? Let me tell you something. Spend some time reading about this guy and read what he does and the focus what he has. And so here you have a guy that, although by some definition you could say he was an actor, but he never really acted. He was 100% on PBS. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, and he really meant it. And he really about it and so forth. And so as I read so much about this guy, it's just sad that that he passed away. In my opinion, he passed away still at a young age. I mean, he was in his 70s. But I mean, to me, of all of the philosophers that I checked, this guy was the greatest philosopher that ever lived. And so I guess I would have to say, if I had to define somebody, as I would put Mr. Rogers at the top of the heap. And the next one would be the person that gives me that vision development, understanding, and that's Dr. Martin Luther King. From an understanding of vision as a whole, particularly that particular period of time, the challenges that were faced upon him, that guy did not stop at his vision. And so those are the kind of the people that I kind of center around, that sort of gives me the energy and the strength of focusing on looking at things we do today.
What do you mean when you say that guy didn't stop at his vision? What do you, does that mean he had a vision and then he went beyond it? What does that mean that he didn't stop at his vision?
Well, let's start when he became, known in the 50s as a result of the Montgomery bus boycott. It was bigger than that. It was one thing about the civil rights movement part of the bus boycott that allowed for equality of every individual and so forth. But he was thinking more than that. He didn't want just equal opportunity for Montgomery, Alabama. He wanted equal opportunity for everybody. His "I Have a Dream" speech is, which I listened to over and over and over again. That's a speech of vision about that, and it was more than just talking about it. It's concepts of how to do it. So that's why I said he never stopped, and he had so many barriers, obstacles placed before him, and it was impacting him. Heck, he had people within his own color that didn't think he was doing the right thing, but he kept focused and he moved forward and so forth. So, yeah, those are the kind of people that I migrate to. Mr. Rogers and Dr. King. What a conversation.
It was funny when you said Mr. Rogers. He gave so I went to Marquette and he gave a commencement speech. I'm gonna find it and I will link to it. He gave a commencement speech, and you, like exactly what you just said. You read it and it's just unbelievable, because I don't think it was taped. It was unbelievable. He was talking about, he swam every day, I think. And like, he was talking about how he would treat the people from the place he swam, and the guy who took his towel, and the guy who cleaned the floor. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to make fun of him because the way he is, right? Oh, Mr. Rogers is changing his shoes. He's got his sweater on. But when you listen to the words, you're like, wow. And I guess as you get older too, there's a little bit more of an appreciation.
Well, yeah, I'd like to see that.
Yeah, I will find it.
I read it, but because I just gorge myself into Mr. Rogers. And the key thing about that and about him was about attention to detail. Because see, as he came on, putting on the shoes, the sweater, it was attention to detail. It was about, let's get comfortable, boys and girls, and and because I'm going to tell you, how life is all about, and how we deal with it, and how to be nice to Mr. Postman, and all these things that come up, but it was the method to his madness was about attention to detail. And that's the other thing that have always had me very fascinated and attracted to the teachings of Mr. Rogers.
That's great. Of all the answers I thought you'd give, he was not one of them. So I would like to thank again Vince Patton, Master Chief, for your time this afternoon. I'll also link back to the podcast that we did in 01, but thank you for appearing with me. I certainly appreciate your time, and love to have you back on just to talk about those core values. Your passion obviously still comes through. Could I just ask you one thing? I said I wasn't going to ask you about, like any journalist who stabs you in the back. We talked about, we're here on the Healthcare Facilities Network, and as you know from the speech you gave a year and a half ago, a lot of people are retiring in healthcare facilities management. We have a huge issue with bringing new people in and people departing. You are still passionate. You're still going strong. Do you ever give any thought to retiring?
Well, as I say to a lot of people, and now I add you to my list, that I publicly say that I will have plenty of time of rest when I'm dead. So
hopefully that
time occurs, I'm gonna keep going like the ever-ready bunny rabbit.
It's great to talk to you. Your passion comes through. Your passion came through on stage. I'm sure it does every time you give one of your speeches and one of your leadership seminars. I greatly appreciate the time that you've given to us this afternoon.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate being here, and call on me anytime.
I will. I will. Don't worry. So this is Peter Martin for the Healthcare Facilities Network. Again, I want to thank my guest, Master Chief Petty Officer Vince Patton. Have a great day, and we will be back with another show. Thanks, Vince.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Healthcare Facilities Network. Please like this video and subscribe to our network and help us succeed in our mission of filling the pipeline of new employees for healthcare facilities management. Thank you so much for watching.